Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome from wherever you're joining us. It is such a joy to have you join this conversation in the first Pan-African Forum of the year 2021. I don't know if it's too late to say Happy New Year. I know some parts of the world are still happily exchanging that greeting, and those of you who are done with this being a new year, bear with us. But welcome to our panel, welcome to each participant. And we want you to think of this as a place where you participate. My name is Mishai Mwangola, and it is such a privilege and a joy to hold the space as we collectively reflect on the practical meaning of the identity African in relation to the range of challenges facing the African continent and diaspora. Today, we will be having the second part of our second conversation. In our first conversation, we began our journey into defining Pan-Africanism, particularly from the experiences as the lived realities on the continent of Africa. In our second conversation, we brought in perspectives from global Africa, reflecting on how Pan-Africanism exists all over the world in what we are referring to as what we call global Africa. I want to thank our hosts, the Elephant, IFRA Nairobi, and Alliance Française de Nairobi for making this space available to us. In a minute, I'll introduce our panel, but let me just give you a sense of how we are going to proceed. I'll start by introducing the panel and the work that they do, and then we'll have a conversation catalyzed by some of the remarks that Professor Campbell made in our December conversation when we began the first part of this particular forum. And you can find that at the Alliance Française YouTube channel and also at the Elephant, along with the other conversations. And we'll be putting links on that on the webinar chat as we go along. And then we'll open up for the conversation. So please feel free to start to put your comments and questions as we go along. If you are joining us on YouTube, you already know where to find the first three conversations, and I hope if you haven't had a chance to listen to them, you will make time in the next few days or weeks to go back and listen to them, or even if you've listened to them before, that you will listen to them again and hear the echoes from those conversations in this one. Please put your questions or your comments in the comment section, and we'll make sure that we'll be keeping an eye on those. And if you are with us in the Zoom room, I'm going to ask, please, if you can put your questions on the Q&A and then put your thoughts in the comments. And so that when I come back to looking at those, I'm able to easily harvest those for the benefit of the panelists. I will privilege the questions, but then I'm also going to try and fit in as many comments as I can. Thank you very much for joining us, and be very welcome to be part of this conversation. So let me go without going too much on other things, straight to introducing the panel at this point. It's an absolute joy. This is the first time I've met both of our panelists, and both in the pre-sessions and in the conversations that we've been having, I have just had the best beginning to the year by discovering their work, by discovering things that they are doing and things that they're pointing me to, and just having a great conversation. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to have that conversation with them. Let me start by introducing Dr. Rahel Kassahun, who is a development economist. Her area of specialization is that she's very invested in the development of human capability, in economic development, in leadership development, and youth development. We'll be coming back to this word development because that's what defines her. That's what she's passionate about. Rahel is the founder and managing director of the African Unbound Center that is in Addis Ababa. And in a couple of minutes, I'll come back and just figure out what this is about. But Rahel, I really want to welcome you to this forum, and I look forward to hearing much more about the work that you're doing. Welcome. Then I will also want to invite our second panelist. Our second panelist is Dr. Amzat Boukari-Yabara, who is a historian. His areas of specialization are African, Caribbean, and Latin American affairs, with particular interest in Black political and grassroots history. He is the author of 2 books, both in French, although he tells me that translations are upcoming. Africa Unite, Une histoire de Pan-Africanisme, and Walter Rodney, Une historienne engagée. And he also is the General Secretary of La Ligue Pan-Africaine Umoja. And so I'm going to just start by, I'll come back to Dr. Kassahun, but perhaps Amzat, if you can just tell me a little bit more about it. Let me start with the books. And I was very, very invested. I found it really interesting that the book on Walter Rodney speaks of him as not just a historian, but an engaged historian. And I have a sense that in your work, that would also describe you. So tell me a little bit more about that book. And then, of course, the book also, Africa Unite. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the issue of writing about Walter Rodney is very important. It's a way of challenging colonial historiography. It's a way of challenging the colonial library and the commitment of Walter Rodney in political situation in Africa, in Guyana, in the Caribbean was really important. I discovered him when I was in the UK. I was working with the Rastafarian movement, and I understood that it was really important. If you want to be Pan-Africanist, if you want to be a committed scholar, to link knowledge with practice, to link theory with practice. And this is something really important. And through Walter Rodney, I had to know about the works of Horace Campbell, who wrote also about Walter Rodney. And from this moment on, I decided to move out of the academia and to engage in political action with the Ligue Pan-Africaine Umoja. So I think that studying the life of Walter Rodney, studying his works is really important for youth today, for African youth today, especially, because we understood that we need to take a choice between our knowledge, our engagement, and our careers. This is really important because I met a lot of people who used to know him, and they were very formative in my own curriculum, in my own militant and academic path. Yeah.
So apart from reading up on him, you actually went to Dar es Salaam, you in Tanzania, you also went to Guyana, and not only just read up, but talked to people who knew him, walked in the spaces where he had worked, and really engaged in those contexts.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting because there are several conceptions of Walter Rodney. Some of them know him as the historian of the Rastafari movement. Others know him as a Marxist historian, a Black Power historian, a political activist in Guyana. And those different visions of the same person is a prototype of Pan-Africanism. It's uniting diversity. We have different visions of the same issue regarding the perspective. Is not remembered in the same way in Tanzania, as in Guyana, as in the US, as in the UK, and so on. So this is really interesting to work on a specific leader who connects several political movements in the 60s and the 70s, who was part of the Latin American dependency theory, who was also engaging with economics. So we need to cross the academic boundaries that divide history, economics, political science, etc. And it is a way of decolonizing knowledge. So I think Walter Rodney is really important, a little bit like Mudimbe, in the way we need to break the colonial library and to open new spaces. And I think that his political engagement is also a very important lesson when we compare with the action of C.L.R. James, when we compare with also some of the leaders of those times, who developed a political approach which was really different from the theoretical approach. So the issue of theory and practice, like Walter Rodney, like Amilcar Cabral, like also Frantz Fanon, is really important when we speak of Pan-Africanism. It's not only words, it's also action.
And you have indeed continued to explore not just the work of Walter Rodney, but really looking at the history of Pan-Africanism in your book, Africa Unite. That is, I think, one of the very few books that has really taken a deep dive into that history that's been published first in French, and later on it will be published in English. Could you say a little bit more about that and link it to your work as the General Secretary of La Ligue Pan-Africaine Umoja, please?
Yeah, it's a first book in French about Pan-Africanism with a global vision. For example, I'm writing on Latin American and Brazilian Pan-Africanism. I'm also connecting the different spaces and eras of Pan-Africanism from the Haitian Revolution until the 21st century. And it's really important because the last book in French about Pan-Africanism was written by a French journalist who was really engaged in the neo-colonial policy. And his works was about how to denigrate Pan-Africanism, because one of his first sentences in this book was, there is nothing to learn about the roots of Pan-Africanism. So we need to write this history, because there is no political change without a collective historical consciousness. So we need to connect the different ways, the different paths of the Pan-African history in the French, so-called French-speaking world, English-speaking world, Lusophone world, and to explain how Pan-Africanism, born in the African diaspora, transitioned to the continental Africa through the role of Kwame Nkrumah. So this is a global history of Pan-Africanism. And from this moment on, I understood that my knowledge could not be kept only for me, only in the academic circle, but need to be expanded in the activist world. So I decided to engage in the Ligue Pan-Africaine Umoja, that is a political organization based in several countries in Africa and also in the African diaspora. And today we are looking for connection in the Anglophone world, because we are more Franco-centered in our vision of Pan-Africanism, and we need to break this rule. And in the Ligue Pan-Africaine Umoja, I understood how the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, that was a French political, a little bit Pan-African party in the 40s and 50s, finally was defeated by the colonial order. I understood our failures. And I think that the most important in writing history is not only about the victory, it's also the defeats, because in the defeat, we learn a lot about the challenge that we need to address right now, today, and tomorrow. So writing history helped me to engage in political action. And if you look at the story of Pan-Africanism, you have several historians like Cher Anta Diop, like Joseph Kizerbo, like John Henry Clark, like Carter Godwin Woodson, who also engage in political action. So we cannot disconnect history and political and social transformation. Yes.
You are indeed an engaged historian yourself. And I have to say this, I went and looked up the League, and I was completely fascinated by the conversations. I think when we first talked about it, I was imagining a very small organization, and it's amazing to see the work that's happening right across global Africa in French, yes, and people engaging different things. And we'll come back a little bit more to that. Rahel, the other thing I have been completely fascinated and enjoyed in this last week is discovering Africa Unbound. What is Africa Unbound?
Africa Unbound is a learning center, basically. Currently, in its current manifestation, it is a museum, and it's also a learning center where we provide various classes and training and development programs at various levels, starting from young people all the way to mid-career professionals, managers, and directors. And so it's basically what Africa Unbound is trying to do, is what it's working towards, is raising our consciousness as Africans, and not just as Africans, but also as global citizens. Who are we? We're very much interested in diving deep into this, the questions, the fundamental, basic questions that we have to be clear about. So, the questions such as, who are we? Who do we want to become? And then these questions, we have to look into our past, our ancestors, our rich culture and heritage, the knowledge systems and the wisdom of our ancestors, what they have learned, and the knowledge that they have transferred to us, for us from generation to generation. So we look into, we dig deep into the past to understand who were we, who were our ancestors, what did they know, how did they organize themselves. So these are the questions that we explore. And then we also look into, through our various discussion platforms, where are we? Socially, economically, politically, spiritually, and various aspects of who we are, the various dimensions of who we are. So we explore the work of African Unbound, digs deep into the present day. Where are we now? Where do we find ourselves? And then it's also looking forward. What does it take for Africa to be unbound? What are the elements? What are the facts? What do we have to build on? Our talents and our skills and our knowledge systems, the way we organize ourselves, and our ideals. What are the ideals that we want to work towards? What kind of world do we want to create for ourselves and for future generations? So these are the questions that we are fascinated with, and it's not just a fascination, it is deep exploration. We have discussions, we we write about these issues, and as I said, we provide training programs and various kinds of. We have a special focus on young people, because you see, young people get it. There's the woke generation. There are young people who are part of this Africa Unbound movement, who are very much interested in, digging deep into what is this life about? What is my role in it? And they're asking the fundamental, the deep questions. And so those are the people that are interested in Africa Unbound and the work of Africa Unbound. And in short, that's what we do.
You were sitting, and I'm going to use my imagination, but you were sitting in DC, a development economist working with a huge multinational and working, as people would say, in all these amazing, quote unquote, the center of the world, and working on economic policy, development, all that stuff. Why did you decide in that part of your life, I need to focus and start up Africa Unbound? Out of all the many things you could have been doing, why was this so important to you?
Ooh, great question. So I started my professional life at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and working on policy issues in Africa. I was working in the Africa region. And being there in the Africa region, I had the opportunity to travel to many, many countries across the continent. And also had a chance to work with ministries, government ministries and agencies, and people who are in the policy circle in that space. But I also had a chance to meet with everyday people, people who are in the private sector, businessmen and women, people who are in the creative industries, writers and artists and singers and poets. And I was absolutely amazed by the quality of talent and then the passion of everyday people and the drive, basically, people, all kinds of people, everyday people wanting to make a difference in their own communities, and some on larger scales. And I was absolutely, I was very, very encouraged. It was very exciting to connect with these people. And what I was thinking, I want to keep in touch with these people. Yeah, I love what I do for the World Bank. I still love policy analysis, policy reform, formulation, and all of that. I think it's very, very important work. But I had a chance to see what became clear to me is this: development is not just the business of governments and these multinational institutions. Everyday people have to get involved. If we want progress, as you know, in a more rapid, if we want rapid transformation, and if we want to create the world that we believe that we deserve to live in, we need to get involved. Every one of us have a role and responsibility and a right to engage in this process in the most meaningful way, whatever we feel is our part, in the sense, that depends on our talent and our skills. And so there are people who are tapping into their innate potential, innate skills to make a difference. So I wanted to create a platform that that can connect all these people. So I established the Africa Unbound online platform in 2010, and we started publishing the online publication. Scholars and journalists and everyday people have been contributing to this journal. And that was going really, really well. And then from there, we had a print edition, launched the Africa Unbound on radio program in collaboration with 8 radio stations across the continent. And that also was a way of engaging people in these conversations. What is our role? How can we contribute? How should we contribute? What's important to us? What are we doing? What are people doing in different the continent, all across the continent? So it's a way of kind of connecting to one another. It's a way of kind of learning that and shining a light on the fact that there are so many of us who are so passionate about making a difference, who love this continent and want to see want to see people of Africa prosper, the well-being of Africans to be front and center, because that hasn't been the case. If we look at the global history, our history and economic systems and political systems, it has not been people-centered. It has not been, certainly has not been, has not promoted the well-being of Africa. So, and it is our responsibility. Who better to focus on these things and work towards the well-being of Africa than ourselves? So that's what drove me to establish this platform, or the Africa Unbound movement. My work has been, as I said, the policy work that I do has been, I loved it. I loved working for the World Bank, but because I was working in a framework of an institution, my contribution was very, very limited. I knew after about 7 or 8 years of working there, I knew I could not use all of my creativity and all of my I couldn't put all of my passion into the work that I was in the way that I had wanted it. So, it was obvious I needed to just start my own organization and build it from the ground. So that's the story.
And indeed, I find, we're going to talk about what's your own responses to what Professor Campbell said to us in the first conversation. But what I find really interesting is that both of you are looking at, first of all, what do we have to learn from the past? And Rahel, I hope you'll mention something about the museum as we go ahead, but that you're both very invested in that there are lessons from the past, that there is a lot of work to do in the present, especially when you talk about policy work. And I was very interested to find out that you've made sure that the museum is located close enough to the African Union for people to be able to come in and go out and always reflect about how history continues to influence and engage with the present and with the future. But that you're also really invested in everyday struggles, both of you, of people who are very much clear about this thing that we're calling, or at least are interested in engaging with this thing that we're calling Pan-Africanism. I'm going to ask each of you if you could just give me a working definition of Pan-Africanism from where you stand. How do you think about it? How do you, so as we continue to engage in what you're saying, we're holding on to those definitions. Amzat, would you like to go first?
Yes, I think Pan-Africanism is has several definitions, like was Campbell told it. First of all, it's combination of African elements that survived to deportation out of the African continent. And it's the issue of survival and creativity. So it's a cultural matter. And it's also a movement of solidarity and liberation of Africans in and out of Africa. So it is about the anti-slavery, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movement. It's also a political doctrine of unification of African states in the time of decolonization. And from the political definition to the socio-political definition, we have two different visions. One is the bottom-up social struggle made by the people, and the other one is a top-down and continental policy made by the states. So we have two different visions of this Pan-African movement. And we also get an history and a geopolitics of Pan-Africanism that I call the global African family, which decolonized history, showing that African history started long before we used to know, with the systematic reference to Egypt that is essential to the cultural renaissance, that is central to Pan-Africanism. And on the other side, because we get this colonial narrative of the discovery of Africa, and Pan-Africanism contributes to explain that African historicity is different than the colonial historicity, and the geographical size is also different. There is an Africa out of Africa. And this is something really interesting because it decolonized both history and geography. It decolonized time, showing that the Haitian Revolution in the end of 18th century is the starting of the contemporaneous African history that is not starting in the 60s with African independence. It started at the end of the 18th century with the Haitian Revolution, in the same time of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the British Revolution, and so on. So now on a more practical vision, I think that Pan-Africanism is a commitment. And I remember that Walter Rodney used to say that when you are in a Pan-African action, you need to define your own situation in the place of the Black world where you belong, where you are based. This is the first issue. Second issue, you need to present your situation and the definition of your situation to the other parts of the Black world, so that we can get a connection, we can get an exchange about where we are in each one situation. And third, you need to explain the situation of the Black world and focus on the specific experience of each part of this African and Black world. And from this moment on, you can address to African people the situation they are in. You give an analysis, and then you give this analysis to the other movement of the third world and the global world. And at last, you contribute to global policies. So I think that Pan-Africanism is not something that is closed, that is just between Africans, just between Blacks, but it is something that starts from the Black experience and then show to the rest of the world how this Black experience is central to the rehumanization of the world. So I think there are connection with Ubuntu, with Umoja, and with several elements of definition that were given by Horace Campbell, yes.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, one of the things that he really emphasized was how, for him, Pan-Africanism was about transcending the borders that divide us and affirming this human and dignity. And you know, went on about how important it is that if we as Africans are able to assert what it means to be human, are able to enjoy all the rights, you know, whether it's to life, to health, and are able to repair the human spirit, then everybody in the world is able then, we know, to access those rights and to be able to also affirm their own humanity. Rahel, how would you define Pan-Africanism?
I really like what Amzat said about Pan-Africanism being a commitment. I very much agree with that. It is a commitment. It's a deep commitment. For me, I have a very simple definition, working definition of what Pan-Africanism is about. It's a heart-based definition. Anybody who loves Africa is a Pan-Africanist to me. Because you see, when we love something, we want to take care of it. We want the best for it. We give our best and we bring our best to it. So it's you know, there are, so it's not being an African does not make us an Pan-Africanist, obviously, and there are a lot of non-Africans who fit in that category, who really love, who care deeply about Africa and have worked all their lives for the betterment of Africa and African people, whether it's in, you know, healthcare or education, environmental stewardship, or whatever it may be, whatever the sector or whatever the area of interest. For me, anybody who wants the best for Africa, who cares deeply and engages in some kind of work and brings the mind and also the heart into what they do, is a Pan-Africanist.
Okay, so you would agree with his insistence that when we talk about Pan-Africanism, it's anchored on the identity of Africa, but this could be through ancestry, it could be through choices that people make. I love what you said, a choice to love Africa, to love the people of Africa, and to engage with the lived circumstances of those people. What else was there that really struck you about some of the things that he said that you might want to pick up on a little bit?
What Amzat said, or sorry.
Let's start with him and then we'll open it up to what Amzat or your own thoughts on Pan-Africanism. What else do you think is really, really important that you would like us to talk a little bit more about?
Well, I think, you know, you really have to focus on this idea of humanizing the world. You know, I was thinking about this. We're talking about Africans being human. And for me, this is, you know, in a way it bothers me because, of course, we're human. We are the original human beings. Humanity originated and developed for millions of years here on this continent. And then it's from here that our ancestors moved to different parts of the world. So, you know, I was thinking, you know, what is this discussion about asserting our humanity or being human? but then, I thought about our history, more recent history, starting from slavery, colonialism, and what has happened since then. And if we look at, for example, if we look at the situation in America, in the United States, African people, Black people were considered 3/5 human beings. Okay, 60%, not 100% human, 60% of a human being. So for many years, for at least 200 years, people of African descent believed, they were told, they were treated as 3/5 of human beings. If it's a man, that's what a Black person is. So if you start from there, then of course there's all the struggle. Are we human? Are we fully human? Are we equal? Are we not? But then, if we really start, human history didn't start 200, 300, or 500 years ago. Human history, Salam is the remains of a female hominid species that was found here in Ethiopia. She's 4.4 million years old. Lucy, 3.3 million years old, also found in Afar in recent Ethiopia. So, human history goes back millions of years. And so we have been human for many, many, many years before Europe was formed, before the Americas were formed, or before they were populated, formed. So we are the original human beings, and we need to occupy a space as such. And then, so, I don't want to get too much into the conversation. I think maybe I don't want to jump forward, but I think, for me, really, I would love for us to talk more about this idea of being human as, African, the humanity of African, people of African descent. And then, the more important question, how can we help the world become more humane? Because we've seen acts of, inhumane activities and crime that have been committed for years, for decades, for millennia. And so we need to address that. And what is Africa's contribution in humanizing the world? Those are the areas that I really would love for us to talk more about. And
this question of how do we repair the human spirit, not just of people who are African and identify as African, but then, we often always think of other people coming to help us, and we say, actually, it's the other way around. We are working together to repair our spirit as human beings, but there are unique things that we can do, partly because of the very rich history that we have, you have talked about. Amzat, what were you particularly struck by in the earlier conversation with Horace Campbell that you would want us to talk a little bit more about?
Yes, I think it was really important that he addressed the issue of Haiti, because Haiti is a birthplace of Pan-African history, and it's also the first decolonization in the French history, in the French Empire, in the French colonial history, 150 years before Indochina or Algeria. And it was the first time that slaves took their freedom and created a new state in the modern sense, in the Western sense. But it was boycotted by all the imperialist power at the time, French, British, Spanish, Americans, and so on. So Haiti is a little bit the birth of what we call the international community that were aligned against the birth of an African nation out of Africa. So I think it's really interesting to get this issue, because after the abolition of slavery, we get the colonial partition of Africa. And Roas Campbell explained how it was negotiated between the foreign powers, and how we still have today a colonial partition of Africa with Anglophone, Lusophone, and Francophone, and so on. And I think that the issue of Haiti is also really important because it's the first decolonization in the French Empire, but it's also the birth of the debt mechanism, because Haiti was imposed upon a debt to pay to France for its freedom. And it was the start of a neo-colonial policy. So Haiti is the birth of Pan-African history and also the birth of neo-colonialism. And this is something really important when we look at the African independence that were taken in the 60s mainly, but were turned into something different than the Pan-African model. And when Haiti got its independence, it was also really important because it gave to African people a model of resistance, a model of struggle, and also a diplomatic connection. And we know that Haitians like Benito Sylvain were engaged with Menelik II from Ethiopia in 1897 during the Adwa battle. We also get connection with Antenor Firma, who wrote a very important book in 1885 about de l'égalité des races humaines, about equality of human races, that was targeting all the racist and colonialist theories at the time that were explaining that Africans, Black, were under the other races. So IT provided a genealogy of Pan-African resistance, and also an intelligentsia, a Black intelligentsia, that contribute to the emergence of Pan-Africanism. Another point that Roas Campbell addressed was the engagement. His own engagement, I think, is someone really important in our history because he had a theoretical vision and a practical experience of Pan-Africanism. And when he spoke of the East African community, because he lived and he worked in East Africa, in Eastern Africa, and we use it to compare with the situation in West Africa when he explained the relationship between Nkrumah and Nyerere in 1963 at Addis Ababa, when one was saying that we need a continental government, and the other said that we need to move by a regional approach. I think it's also really important to focus on this point because we are still in this issue of, are we going on a continental side or a regional approach? And we don't really know what is the agenda today. And he also explained the situation in 2007 at the Accra African Union Summit with the debate on the government of continental Africa and the way it was destroyed by the war on Libya and the assassination of Gaddafi. So I think that Roas Campbell gave the very important points on the story of Pan-Africanism. He explained that it was about ending slavery, ending colonialism, ending Jim Crow laws, ending apartheid. And he explains that there were a series of victories in this Pan-African history. But still today, we need to keep the struggle alive. And his references to Tajoudim were really important because in the French-speaking world, these are names that nobody knows. I used to read the postcard of Tajoudim. I used to read about Pambazooka News. But in the French activist Pan-African world, it's not known. So we really need to connect and reconnect all this situation. And what is really interesting with Roas is that he also speaking about the French colonial situation today in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, in Guyana, and also with the currency, the French currency in West Africa. So he's connecting the past and the present, and he explained how we have a tunnel of resistance, a bridge of solidarities And I think it's exactly what Pan-Africanism is, a bridge of solidarity. Now, I think that in his interview, he also addressed the issue of gender. That is really, really important because there are two different visions of the gender issue in Africa. One is very neoliberal, and the other one is more grassroots. And we need to understand, and we need to show the role played by women in Pan-African history. And to show this role played by women needs to rewrite this history of Pan-Africanism that is mainly male-centered. And this is also a task, this is also a challenge that we need to do right now. And we can rely on the experience of someone like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who in 4 years, from 1983 to 1987, led a revolution with women, with youth, with workers, with peasants. And that is also the issue of Pan-Africanism from below. And I think that is really important, that we move from this idea of Pan-Africanism falling from the sky, this top-down approach, and understand that this movement is historically rising from the roots and rising in the sky. So all these elements were on my mind really important, and I have no critics to do to Horace because he's a master, he's a mwalimu. So I think he did a very good interview and very precise and very, very interesting interview. Yes.
I would agree with you on everything practically you've said. And I think yesterday, one of the things you brought up when we were having our conversation, and you've emphasized today, is how we often don't know, especially if you're in Anglophone Africa, you may not fully appreciate the experiences of Africans who have lived in other spaces where they're speaking other languages, and where we may not always be able to learn from those experiences, and how absolutely critical that is. And I think that is some of what your work has pointed to. And I also appreciate your points, the ones that you have made in terms of the question of connections, and connections across geography, connections again across time, connections across generations, and investing in each other wherever they are, so that we are learning more. I'd like to ask Rahel what else she would like to pick up from the conversation. But before I do, I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about what are some of the other lessons that we might be able, those of us in Anglophone Africa, since we are primarily, that's who our audience has been since we are speaking in English. What are some of the lessons, other lessons that you feel we missed out on, that perhaps we don't talk as much? I mean, you've talked about how there's a lot to learn about neocolonialism. There's a lot to look at the roots of Pan-Africanism from the Francophone world. And these are some of the conversations that I know at La Ligue you're working on. But is there anything else you would like to add in that conversation?
I think the practical issue to connect all this issue of geographics, generation, etc., is about the tradition of Pan-African congresses, of Pan-African conferences, of Pan-African meetings, where you have Africans coming from all over the world, all over Africa, that met at one specific point. We can speak of the 1958 Accra conferences in December, and they explain their own situation, and then each one returned in his country. So there was this tradition. And the difficulty is that the French Pan-African, the French nationalists were excluded from the movement because of the specific French assimilationist policy that used African elites in his own circle. So we have this gap that is starting from 1919 at the Paris First Pan-African Congress between Blaise Diagne and W.E.B. Du Bois, that we need to reconnect today. We need to also work on translation from English writers to French writers. That is more common than in the other side. I think that I can take the example of Walter Rodney. Only his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is translated into French, and the translation is very bad, and the book is almost impossible to find today. So we have all this gap. We are a long, long way behind in the Francophone sphere, but in the same time, we have a different perspective, because our position was a little bit more cultural than political due to the specific situation in the French colonial era, different than in the British and also the American situation. And on the other side, we also get a colonial situation today due to the specific position of France in the world, and the fact that France has a different conception of universal, of republican, of indivisibility of its nation, of its history, that is really difficult to tackle today. For example, in the French academia, speaking on Pan-Africanism is difficult, and engage a debate on, for example, critical race studies, like in the US, like in the UK, on multicultural issue, is really difficult. So we have all those obstacles to engage today, only in the academic circle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we'll be coming back to the question of language. I think a very important point that you've made. It's not just about the words that people speak, but we're also then talking about a philosophical approach to engaging issues and a conceptual approach. There's something you said, and I just want to go back to, and this was when we had our conversation yesterday, that even this thing of, do we call it Pan-Africanism as two words, or do we have a hyphen joining them, or is it one word, becomes an entire philosophical and conceptual thing that we don't really engage with in English, perhaps in the way that would be engaged with in France. I know next month we will be talking specifically on the question of language and the question of this philosophical conceptual approach. If you have anything to add to that, I'll be happy to hear that.
Yes, briefly, the issue is that in French, Africanism is about the colonial science of Africa, and it got a very negative vision. When we speak of Africanism, we are speaking about white settlers, white researchers, or white production of colonial knowledge. White, I said it, but it's also black. There are also black researchers that are working in this kind of academic vision. So it's really difficult. But when I speak of Africanism on my mind, I'm speaking about the definition of Melvin Herskovits about the retention of African cultural influence in the societies of the New World. So it's a different vision, but it's a definition that is rooted in the Anglophone academia, and not in the French academia, where Africanism is a very negative, has a very negative impact.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And we'll really delve into that next month. And it's great that you opened that thought. Rahel, these words have stayed in my mind since I heard you speak them. And you talked about the importance to bring up a new generation. And then you used this phrase, we need to be architects for the future. And when we're thinking about policy, and I know Horace Campbell talked a lot about the kind of policy decisions, the kind of real practical projects that people engage, we're not only talking about now in the present, but we're also talking about the future. And often when we talk about youth, we talk about youth in terms of leaders of tomorrow, in this hazy sense of, you don't do anything now, do it, wait for your turn. But I really was caught by the way you spoke about youth development and this idea of, we are creating the future now, and we're also preparing for the future. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, as you also just anything else that Horace Campbell said that you want to bring into the conversation, as I start to go towards some of the questions that are coming up.
Absolutely, yes. So, like Amzat said, it's very difficult to have an issue with anything that Professor Campbell said. He's a master, yes. His arguments are very tight, And I agree with everything that he said. I want to highlight a few things that he said and just make a few comments about some of the points that really struck me or that I deeply agree with. You know, he said there's need to overcome humanity's divisions. So that is where we start. That's the premise that we start. Where we start. It's you know, in the African Unbound Museum, we have a section that talks about how 200,000 years ago was well, okay, let me put it. Every single human being living on the planet today can trace their lineage back to a single woman who lived in this Africa, the East Africa region, 200,000 years ago. That's huge. And we talk about Pan-Africanism, talk about being, you know, connected. And we're deeply interconnected, inextricably connected. We've known that. Our ancestors have known that, and that has been demonstrated in philosophies such as Ubuntu and others. But you know, science, geneticists found out and demonstrated very clearly, and this is a study that has been that was when it was first published in 1986, it was very, very controversial because the woman who led this expedition, a woman known as by the name of Rebecca Khan, she published the study in 1986, and there were a lot of people who were deeply disturbed by that finding. She talked about, she said in her interviews, she said, you know, that her own family members were very angry with her because they said, you know, look, you know, our ancestors did not come from Africa. You know, our grandmother is not Black, and that kind of pushback. So the point is, you know, Professor Campbell saying, you know, we need to overcome our division, the division among human beings. So yes, we do. I mean, it's time. We have gone through periods where you know, the division has caused a lot of destruction, and we are now at a point where science is putting it with the spiritual, the elders, our elders, and the spiritual leaders have always told us. So if we start there, that's the premise that we should be working with. And I want to just highlight a couple of things that I took from what he said. He said we should not internalize European conception of humans. Africans would have to transcend the European idea of human beings and raise it to another level. This is in the tradition of Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney, who have been talking about we need to get to another level. We cannot be stuck in this very backward definition of what human beings are, or this very intentional way of dividing people within the same country, within the same continent, within the same local, within the same families. I mean, you know, so the division is something that was done very intentionally in order to control, in order to extract our resources. And we are now at a point in our development, there's enough information, there's enough research has been done, enough books have been written, and we need to understand, okay, you know, the divisions, the divide and conquer has gotten us to a point, this point where we have been waging war against each other. The Francophones versus the Anglophones, and then, you know, the Northerners versus the South, and all kinds of division, you know, the length of, the size of your nose, the color of your skin. All kinds of divisions have kept us undeveloped, have kept us distracted from the work that needs to be done. So I fully agree with him. We need to come up with another definition of, we need to transcend it. And what does it mean to be a human being in this 21st century? So it's that's something that really struck me. And then something that is very important, in our political and economic discourse here in Ethiopia these days. He talked about water resources, the need to share our resources. We are on the same continent. There are these borders that were very arbitrarily drawn borders. But then we have these resources that must be shared, that are, our lives depend on these resources. So he talked about the need for cooperation and collaboration. So the use of the Nile River in particular, now a very, very sensitive topic. The use of the Nile between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia is now a very, very contentious issue. And I'd like to ask, what is the Pan-African position on this issue? Because others have been commenting on it. The former U.S. President Donald Trump said something I don't want to repeat, but something that is absolutely outrageous about this issue. So Egypt has been the Nile has been used disproportionately by Egypt and to a much lesser extent in Sudan. Now there's the Renaissance Dam that is being built in Ethiopia is very much an act of self-determination, because here in Ethiopia, many, for decades now, starting with Emperor Haile Selassie, they tried to build a dam to use the water of the Nile to cultivate land in that region. And that has been impossible. Nobody wanted to finance it because of Egypt. Egypt felt like, this was any diversion, any use of the water was just not acceptable to Egypt. And many others supported that position. And that goes back to the agreement that we signed. Basically, it's the British who came up with this arrangement that gave disproportionate use of the Nile to Egypt, and then some to Sudan, and very little of it to Ethiopia. Ethiopia virtually has made no use of it until recently. So, if we're talking about being Pan-Africanists, we need to understand, and then being human. What does it mean to be human? We have to look beyond our own individual needs. We have to go beyond. We have to look at the community. We have to look at the global community, not just within our own borders, but because we are inextricably connected. What happens? The Ubuntu philosophy. What affects you affects me. I am because you are, and that level of understanding of our connection is important. And if we are saying, okay, yes, we are about yes, we are about Pan-Africanism, then we really need to understand how are we using on the practical when it comes to issues on the ground, when it comes to issues of livelihood. How are we making decisions? So we have to be our brother's keepers. We have to look. there's enough for everybody to share. There are ways, there is enough fresh water for everybody to drink. There is enough land for everybody to eat 3 meals a day. It's greed that has been killing us and has been hampering our growth and development. So if we can work on the mindset, we can begin to understand that there is enough, that we can just learn to look beyond our individual. And a lot of this is really, Walter Rodney and others wrote about it extensively. The capitalist system, what it's done to us, this need for more and more and more, and maximizing profit at any cost, and then minimizing the cost, regardless of what it's costing humans or the environment. This drive for this insatiable appetite for more is the problem. So we need to examine. We need to, as Walter Rodney and others wrote about, how Europe underdeveloped Africa and other seminal work. We really need to examine the economic system that got us here, and really begin to think about what else is possible. What kind of economic systems will work for us better. Because you see, all of these things can be changed. The socialism didn't work very well, particularly here in Africa. It didn't distribute wealth, it distributed poverty for the most part. And then, basically now capitalism system is the prevailing economic system. It's been good. It drove innovation, material wealth like we've never seen before, and on many fronts, we've made huge progress as a species, as human family. But this is not the best we can do. There are ways we need to start thinking about what else is possible. What else can we come up with that will serve humanity better in the coming years? So, sorry.
No, I was agreeing with you.
And then Professor Campbell talked about the two main tasks for the Pan-African movement. One, he said, is the humanizing of the planet, and the unification and freedom for Africans at home and abroad. And I couldn't agree. The humanizing of the planet is very much needed, because if we can just go back to the basics and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human? How do we, as human beings, how do we need to relate with one another? How do we relate with ourselves within our own internal world? And how do we relate, interact with others, people in our communities, people on the other side of the globe? Because we really need to, as Africans, it's time to really spread our wing and exist in this world as global citizens. The whole world belongs to us. There's nowhere that we do not belong. Okay, there's enough. As I said, there's enough for everybody. So if we can just work within, I truly believe we need mindset transformation. We need to see ourselves as capable human beings, as capable beings who can be more, who can do more. And then, you know, it's just assert ourselves in the world, not as, you know, not in a very kind of a timid way as we have in the past, but you know, as individuals who have so much to contribute, who have contributed a whole lot. Winston Churchill said, history is going to be kind to Britain because I'm going to write it. The history books have been written by individuals who want to tell their side or what the story that they feel that they want the world to know. We need to start writing our own history. We need to write, and I mean, you know, history, I don't, by that, I don't mean we can just make up anything we want, but we, you know, like Sheikh Anta Diop have done, and many others have done, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, conduct research. Let's find out, you know, who were we? What have we done to contribute to the world? And much has been done. I mean, much has been uncovered now to let us know that our capabilities are unlimited. There's so much we can be, so much we can do, and this is our time. So, you know, enough. As Martin Luther King said, you know, we need to feel the urgency of this time to move forward in a very kind of decisive way and claim our place in the world.
That is so true. And I'm just looking at some of the questions and comments, and I agree completely with Rachel Dianga, who says, I'm really glad to be here. I like the two panelists' definition of Pan-Africanism. She said this when you were talking about your definitions, but also the way you feed into each other. And it struck me as you talked about what's going on with the dam and the lessons for that, how you go back into history and then go back into the future, how much that echoed with what Amzat was saying about Haiti, for example. And it's really interesting when we think about, we root ourselves in the places that we are, in the time that we are, but we are connected to all of these other spaces. I want to look at a couple of the questions that have come in. Awori Otieno was asking and saying, thank you for engaging with this discussion, and wanted to know the full name of Tajuddin, who was referenced by Dr. Amzat Boukari when he talked about the difference in knowledge between Anglophone and Francophone Pan-Africanist spaces. I've put that on the web chat, just for him, so that he would also get a link to the book, which is Speaking Truth to Power. But I wondered if you wanted to add anything to that, Amzat. The book is Speaking Truth to Power, and it is by Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a collection of letters sent by Tajuddin, published in Pambazuka. And you also have the report of the 7 Pan-African Conference in 1994 in Kampala, that you can also take as an example of a reflection of what should be Pan-Africanism in the 21st century, with the issue of globalization, with the issue of gender issue, in the era of the fall of the Organization of African Unity. So there were lots of perspectives, including the geographical perspective. So you have a map of, I think that it's Arthur Dikwandi, that draw a new map of Africa where you have no isolated country, and each part of Africa has an access to the sea. So it's all those issues. If we can make a connection with the case of Ethiopia, that has no access to the sea, that is enclaved. So all those issues are really important to address, the boundaries, African boundaries, and also the boundaries in the mind. So it's all those issues that Tajuddin was fighting against, and it's also the division, because we have in Pan-Africanism some bitter ideological and ego conflicts between those who are left Pan-Africanists, that say revolutionary and grassroots movement, those who have a racial Pan-African vision, a kind of separatist and patriarchal vision, quite reactionary, those who are on a cultural Pan-Africanism, quite elitist, sometimes a little bit mystical, and those were on a national Pan-Africanism with a very liberal conservative vision. So we need to engage all those issues, all those debates regarding the different conception, ideological conception of Pan-Africanism, and the position of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim was really, really interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Joe John has a couple of comments. He picked up on what you said, Rahel, and when you're talking about Ethiopia, and he was thinking of Maza Mengistu's book, The Shadow King, and how he talks about the role of women in the struggle of Adwa. I think that also connects back to what Horace Campbell talked about, how important it is to not leave out, and often in a lot of the history, we don't talk about what women have contributed and how women continue to engage. So I think he was appreciating that. And then he had a comment on language, and we will be going on to the idea of language and how we can work with language in detail next week. But if any of you has a comment on that, I'd be happy to hear that. But let me also ask this other question. What could we do to break the shackles of funding on initiatives in Africa coming from the global north? Just reflecting on one thing we know is that Africa is very rich, yet we always are dependent on aid. So he had that trio of questions and comments. Does any one of you want to reflect on any of these?
I think it's about economic self-reliance, and there are several African governments that try to make it happen in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, before the structural adjustment program. I'm thinking of Tanzania, I'm thinking of Burkina Faso. Economic self-reliance with a deconcentration of the economic state system, with cooperatives, with community action. I think it was part also of the struggle against apartheid. So we need to address the struggle against capitalism. And also, maybe we could work on a continental fiscal policy regarding the multinational firms. I think it's really important. No country isolated can engage with the huge big firms. But if all African countries implement a continental fiscal tax policy, it could happen. But now we are in the situation of the continental area trade in Africa. And I'm not sure that all those issues has really been explored. And I'm afraid that we remain with this neoliberal vision, the cake of the foreign powers right now. So we need to engage economic self-reliance, to engage monetary liberation, especially also in the French, in the Francophone sphere. And we also need to engage, economically speaking, with the African diaspora, because we know that the African diaspora invests more money in Africa than the international public aid, for example. So it's all those issues that we could engage. And I think it's possible to reverse the balance of power, of economic power in the 21st century, but it's a very difficult challenge. And another one issue, I think, it's also working on grassroots economy, because most of African economics is informal economy, and we need to understand how it works out of the classic economic system.
Rahel, I think you had spoken to this, but if there's anything else you want to add before I ask for your final comments.
I do. Okay, so my view about aid is this. I do agree with Amzat. Yes, we need economic reliance, self-reliance, not just economic. Self-reliance is exactly what we should be working towards day and night. But we do live in a globalized world, and we cannot. There's no going back. There's no going back. We're becoming more and more integrated, and that's a good thing. And we need to push harder, actually, for greater economic and political integration within the continent. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is not going to be a panacea. There are a lot of issues with that agreement, and implementation has been very, very slow. So this is exactly why we, as citizens, we have to be fully engaged. The private sector can benefit so much if this agreement is implemented, or if the implementation process goes as planned. But as I said, it's been very, very slow and has been delayed for many reasons. So we need to push. We need grassroots organizations. We need private sector associations, various trade associations who can benefit so much from this to really put the pressure on the decision makers to implement in a more effective way, in a more efficient way. So one thing, we need to work towards self-reliance. We need to be, and in order for that to happen, we need to be engaged. Everyday people have to be engaged. That's how it's going to work. If you leave it, if you continue to leave it to institutions, many of our institutions, our government agencies, are dealing with very, very complex issues. They are engaged in firefighting and are not very good at strategic planning, and implementation has been a major, major challenge in just about every sector. So, point is, we have to be engaged. But then, going back to the question of aid, we're not generating enough revenues. Most of our governments are not mobilizing enough resources from the taxes and other sources domestically. That's a huge challenge for just about all of our countries. So we do need aid. We can't do without it at this point. We cannot, as we're working towards self-determination and economic self-reliance, we also need aid. We need aid, foreign aid. And my view is actually the West owes us. The West needs to finance our development programs and our projects. There's a lot of money that is flowing out of the continent. Illicit financial flows are estimated to be much, much greater than the resources that are coming into the continent. So, and then, the resource extraction and all the work that has been done to erode our capacity to produce and develop, the interruption in our own development. The West needs to pay for that. So my view is the West owes Africa. But it's also our responsibility to use our resources in a more effective way. We have been very inefficient in the way we're using our resources. So we need to work on that too. That's my view.
I think that's going to be probably something we should consider having an entire session on, resourcing Pan-Africanism. I think that's a really great question. And I'm really sorry that we've actually run out of time, but you've left us with a lot of food for thought. I'm going to ask you for your final comments. As I do that, Amzat, Awori Otieno has asked a question, if you could fold that into your final comments, which is directly to you. what do you make of the obstacles to Pan-Africanism in countries like Uganda, where any form of opposition to the regime is heavily, I think he meant repressed, and where leaders are supported by the neo-colonial powers? How does one organize within a context of violence? That's also a huge, we could talk about that, I think, for another hour, but I'll give you some time to think about that, and then you can also give us your final comments. And as you think about that, Rahel, what is the one thing you would want to leave in our minds as we close?
Well, as we close, we need to keep Pan-Africanism alive. We need it. There is something that it's an idea that brings us together as lovers of Africa, as people who are working towards the advancement of Africa. So we all need to understand, what does that mean we all need to define what Pan-Africanism means to us individually. But my sense is that we have a bright future ahead of us. We have the resources in terms of the human resources is here. There are enough people who are passionately working towards the advancements and the improvement of their own communities. And so if we can bring these efforts together, we can highlight and we can take encouragement and inspiration from these efforts all across the continent. This, at the end of the day, is what will save Africa. So, yeah, that's it.
And that's great. That's an absolute good challenge to take us into the future. Amzat.
Yes, I think the issue of reparation was really important in Owas Campbell's speech, and the question about economic self-reliance is aligned with the issue of reparation. How do we repair? How do we consider that the most tragic period of African history led to the most fruitful movement and ideas, that is Pan-Africanism? That is very important to understand, that when we speak of Pan-Africanism, we are speaking of the most fruitful movement of ideas that was born in the Black world. So this is really important. So we have empathy, we have motivation, we have resilience, we have surrendering, and so on. And the struggle that we are fighting today in Uganda, in Guinea, in Côte d'Ivoire, in many, many countries in Africa, where we have the same situation, with the difficulty to engage a transformation, a political transformation, needs to reconnect with what we used to call the international solidarity. I think that we need a solidarity of people, peoples in struggle, because the situation in Uganda is the same situation as in many other African countries. So we need to connect those people. We need to connect those leaders or those groups, those collectives who want to change the future of Africa and to reorganize internationalism, Black internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and to get a global agenda at the continental level regarding these transformations that we want to impulse from below on a Pan-African position. We also need to work on history, because when we are speaking of generation, we are also speaking about Sankofa, about go back and get it, about how we should selectively take care from the past and keep what is good for us to move forward. So we need to get a dynamic movement. And I think that there are many signs, very, very interesting, of a rising Africa, a new generation of Africans, African youth, but also all the revolutionaries. I always say that all the revolutionaries must fight old reactionaries, like young revolutionaries must fight young reactionaries. And this is why it is really important that we get people like Owas Campbell, who took part in this kind of event. And last point, I'm General Secretary of an organization, the Pan-African League Umoja. We are really working and we are really wanting to work with people in Uganda, in Kenya, in Rwanda, in all East Africa, because we need to exchange our situation all over Africa, because the answer to the crisis in Uganda is maybe in one Francophone country, but we need to study our situation. And the best place to study it is a Pan-African organization. So this is what we are trying to make inside the Pan-African League Umoja, to change civil societies into political societies, but in the highest sense of politics. And I think that it is the real challenge of the 21st century. How do we redefine politics in a Pan-African perspective? How do we forge lessons to reach a critical mass and to support progressive forces in and out of Africa? So we need to explore solutions to African situation. We can speak of Ali Masri, Pax Africana, African solution to African problems. And I think that this is in those areas that we can get a solution to what is happening all over Africa, but also in the African diaspora. And this is precisely the use of Pan-Africanism. Yes.
Oh, thank you both very, very much. You have illustrated, and the word that kept coming up as you were talking was this word connections. Connections across space, connections across time, connections across struggles, connections across language, just bridging these boundaries so that we can make what Amzat has called the most fruitful struggle of ideas in the Black world truly alive in the present and also into the future. I want to thank both of you for everything you have said, for the work that you're doing. We've put links to both Africa Unbound and also to La Ligue Pan-African Umoja and the books that Dr. Amzat has written in the webinar. We'll also be sharing them wherever we will be archiving these conversations. It has been such a great conversation. And I feel even as we sit in Paris, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and all the many places that we are honestly, sincerely working on these connections. I want to thank all the panelists, the participants who have come on board, who've stayed with us, who've put in messages into the chat and into the comment. I absolutely agree with Awori, who has said, Asante Sana for such a rich discussion and precious information. It has come not only from the panelists, it has come from you participants. And I hope that you will join us again in February, on February 23rd. We will be taking the conversation to another level. For this year, we will be now pulling up aspects of Pan-Africanism that have come up in these seminal conversations. We'll begin with a conversation on language, talking about should we have an African language or a few African languages that become the languages of Pan-Africanism. I say this, and I saw earlier today that Ethiopia has just made an agreement with Tanzania to send, Tanzania will be sending teachers to Ethiopia to begin to popularize Kiswahili in Ethiopia and to teach young people to speak Kiswahili. So how many other languages, African languages, can we work like that? How do we work across these borders of the languages that, you know, many of us already have as our lingua franca? And we'll be taking this conversation to another level. And then in March, we will come back and talk about Pan-Africanism and where are the women? How does our Pan-Africanism and feminism, two things that we can put into the same room, have they been in the same room, or are they completely separate from each other? And I think we've been getting some questions on that. So please do stay tuned. We look forward to the conversations. I want to thank Professor Horace Campbell for giving us such a rich place to begin our conversation, and our hosts, The Elephant, Alliance Francaise, and Ifra Nairobi. My name is Mshai Mwangola, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in March. Have a good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.